pay people. That's all management is about, is paying people, right? It's kind of boring. And so I offered these diamond cutters a salary that was like 10 times more than they were currently getting. And I expected them all to say yes immediately. But instead, they said no. What we want to do is we want to first have a picnic. And I was like, okay,
Mm.
well, I can do a picnic too. That's easy. And we got all the way through a bottle of vodka. And by the end, what I realized was that the thing that I had to offer that the state did not have to offer was not money. It was to give a damn. It was, they
Mm.
wanted to know that their boss would care enough about them to get them out of Russia if things went sideways there.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, I've been thinking a lot about those folks lately, because I think they are there. I've lost touch with them,
Mm.
uh, but but I did care, and we had a great relationship, and we had a lot of fun working together. And that was when I realized that being a manager is actually sort of interesting. It's you bring your full humanity to the task, and it's more fun than I understood.
That's such a great special learning. And yes, much, much deeper than just paying people.
Yes.
So I'm glad that you're able to go ahead and start off and sharing things with us right away. So let's get into the conversation. Your first book, Radical Candor, became a New York Times bestseller. So in this book, you give a framework for how to give feedback in a clear, consistent, and kind way. But since publishing that book, you've gotten some feedback that framework might not necessarily work for everyone. Can you share with us a little bit more about that feedback and how that led you to publish Just Work?
Sure, absolutely. I was invited to give a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And I had known the CEO of that company for the better part of a decade. She's a person I like and respect enormously. So I was really excited to give the talk.
Mm.
And when I finished giving the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think that it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone, even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get signed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew that this was true. She's one of too few Black CEOs in tech, or frankly,
Mm.
in any other sector. And I knew that this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I had sort of four revelations at the same time. The first was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be, that I aspire to be. I had failed to be an upstander. I had been sort of a silent bystander to her experiencing that kind of those kinds of comments. And in fact, I often hadn't even noticed the
Mm.
extent to which people were saying things like that to her, and the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant at every meeting we had ever been in together, even though she had what to be ticked off about, as we all do at work.
Of
So
course.
that was the first thing. I'd sort of had to come to grips with my failure as an upstander. The second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her in the workplace, I was also in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me as a white woman in the workplace. I think I didn't want to think of either myself or of her as a victim. And because we have such a strange attitude towards victims in our society. And so I had just been in denial. I'd marched through my whole career sort of pretending that a whole host of things were not happening that were in fact happening. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but there it is. It was the truth. And I think that even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I ever want to think of myself as the culprit. And so I was probably even deeper in denial about the kinds of things that I had done, the biases that I had, the prejudices even that I had, and the times when I had bullied folks. I never intended to do those things, but intentions don't matter. Impact does. And last but not least, I realized that as a leader, I had imagined that I was creating these BS free zones, but I had often failed to do that.
Mm.
And that was those sort of four revelations at the same time are what prompted me to write my next book, Just Work. and to organize it around those 4 different roles, the roles, the roles that we all play. Sometimes we're the leader, sometimes we're the upstander, sometimes we're the person who's harmed, and sometimes we're the person who caused harm. So that was feedback that I'm really grateful for. And I think it's also worth pausing and sort of thinking about the different responsibilities we have in each of those roles, because I had, I think, a responsibility to intervene on behalf of my colleague when she was getting this kind of, because like, it's ridiculous to call her angry, and the fact that people were calling her an angry Black woman was a giant hint that there was there was something else going on besides feedback. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. And I had failed to intervene. But I think when we are the person harmed, and we're all harmed in some way, shape, or form by different biases. We're all excluded sometimes. I think it was incumbent upon me to choose a response rather than to default to silence. I'm not saying you always have to respond, because sometimes it may not be safe for one to do so. And I don't want to get people in more trouble, that, cause more trouble for people than they're already having. But I think that by defaulting to silence, I was giving up my agency throughout my career. And so what I encourage folks to do is to be proactive. If you're gonna choose silence, be proactive. Make that a choice, not a default. Because as Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you. I think it's also worth sort of exploring the hidden costs of silence. Feels safer, but it often is not. And next, the person who caused harm. I think it's really hard to acknowledge when for me at least, and I imagine for a lot of other people as well, when I have said or done something that's biased, when I've said or done something that's actually prejudiced, or when I've bullied someone else. It's really, I feel deeply ashamed. That is not who I imagine myself to be. That's not what I want to be. And so learning how to acknowledge it when we have caused harm and to make amends, not just to apologize, but to really make sure that we know what we did wrong and to take steps to make it right. And last but not least, I think leaders have an obligation, a responsibility to prevent bias, prejudice, and bullying from destroying their team's ability to collaborate. But of course, bias, prejudice, and bullying are almost inevitable. These are human behavior. So at the very least, they need to respond in a way that prevents it from happening again. It's the joy of being a leader, is that you have to prevent things that are bound to happen.
Thank you, Kim. I love that you took that feedback that you received and were so reflective with it, and were able to think through the different ways that individuals could respond, as well as the responsibility that they have. You mentioned the term upstander, which I'll let the audience know. We're going to unpack that a little bit more later in the conversation. Kim, you also mentioned a few other terms that I'd love you to define for the audience. So bias, prejudice, and bullying, if you could give us a brief definition of each of those.
Sure. I think as I was writing the book, I thought about why I so often defaulted to silence. And I think part of the reason is that I was conflating bias, prejudice, and bullying as though they were all the same thing. And they're actually 3 different things. So I wanted to define bias as not meaning it. Bias is usually unconscious. It's reflective of some sort of pattern that is in our society. As human beings, we are pattern makers, but we can also change patterns that are not serving us well, that are harming us. So that's bias. Whereas prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually reflecting some kind of stereotype that is both unfair and inaccurate. And distinguishing between bias and prejudice is really important. And lastly, there's bullying. Usually with bullying, there's no belief, conscious or unconscious, going on at all. It's just being mean. And so for me, it was very helpful to begin. If you want to solve a hard problem, it's useful to break it down into parts and solve one part at a time.
Yes, I think that's super clear and super helpful. Know what you're starting with, and with the Just Work framework, you've also created a response to each of these. Do you want to start with bias? Again, starting with what is it, and then give us an example of a story and how someone should respond in a moment like that. And then we can move on to prejudice and bullying as well.
Sure, absolutely. So, bias again, not meaning it. One of my favorite stories about a great response to bias comes from Aileen Lee, who started Cowboy VC. And she was going into a meeting with two colleagues who were men, and Aileen had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So when they went into the conference room, she sat in the center and her two colleagues sat off to her left. And when the other side filed in, the first person sat across from the guy to Aileen's left, the next person sat across from the guy to his left, and then they filed on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. And that's often how bias shows up, who decides to sit next to or across from whom. Aileen, however, was undeterred and she started talking and explaining things. And when the other side had questions, they did not direct their questions at Aileen. They directed them at her two colleagues who were men. It happened once. Anybody ever hear this happen? Sort of.
Yes, I'm like,
yes.
This is very resonant.
Yeah. So it happened once, it happened twice. And the third time it happened, one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think Aileen and I should switch seats." And that was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. It's an example of an I statement. An I statement sort of invites other people in to notice what's going on and to change it on the assumption that they don't really mean to do it. And as soon as he said that, the dynamic in the room changed and people started listening to Aileen. And that was really important to him. It was, why did he do that? Why did he choose to be an upstander in that moment and in that way? Part of it was that he really liked Aileen and he didn't like seeing her get ignored, but he also did it because he just wanted to win the deal. and he knew that if he couldn't get the other people listening to her, they wouldn't win the deal. So I think it's important to think about both the emotional and the ethical and the practical reasons to disrupt bias. And one doesn't have to undermine the other. In fact, they all work together.
I really like that example because he didn't necessarily even accuse anyone of anything, right?
Yeah.
He just brought attention, like you said,
Yes.
to something. He noticed something and he changed the dynamics in the room.
Yeah, he invited people in to understand. And that's the benefit of, I think, an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded, or I don't, I think that sounded biased even. If you do want to sort of, we don't have to tiptoe around the tulips of bias. We can say it. But I think that what he did was very, very deft in that situation.
Yes, because of course he still needed to win the deal in the end.
Yes, exactly. But so he was sort of holding up a mirror, right? But that doesn't work so well in Prejudice, does it?
Yes, let's get into Prejudice. Yes.
Yeah. Because if you hold up a mirror to Prejudice, the other person's going to grin in that mirror and say, "Yeah, aren't I good looking?" They actually believe that thing, and it's difficult, I think, to imagine often that someone else actually believes that prejudice thing, and I think that's one of the problems in dealing with prejudice is it's really, do you really believe that? So here's an example of a colleague of mine who was dealing with prejudice in a hiring meeting. There was a team of people who had interviewed a bunch of different candidates, and everyone who had interviewed all the candidates agreed that the most qualified person for the job was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the meeting. And when the hiring manager heard that, she said, "Well, I'm not going to extend an offer to that candidate." And my colleague said, "Why not?" And the hiring manager said, "I'm not going to put that hair in front of the business." And this was not a long time ago. And it was at a company that everyone knows and probably has some respect for. So my colleague was shocked. So what could she say in that moment? She could use an it statement. An it statement kind of paints a picture of where the line is between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose those beliefs on others. So an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So it is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state, thanks to the Crown Act. Or it is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. Or if the law and the HR policy hadn't been in place, she could simply have said, it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. And so that's an example of an it statement. Much easier to sit here and say there's a clear line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose it. But where is that line? Like, creating space for conversation to discuss that is really important.
Yeah, I really like in both of these examples, frankly, it is someone else who's stepping in to point out, the bias and the prejudice, and whether it's using an I statement or the it statement. Let's get to the real toughie, bullying.
Yes.
Can you, again, reground us in what bullying is and how someone should respond in that moment?
So bullying at its most basic form is just being mean to someone. And I think a great response to bullying is not an I statement, but rather a you statement. If an I statement kind of invites someone in, a you statement pushes them away a little bit. My daughter actually taught me this. When she was in third grade, she was getting bullied on the playground. And I was encouraging her to say, assume good intent of this kid and say to this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she bangs her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? I had to admit, that's a really good point. And so a you statement, it's not the most dramatic thing in the world, but you can't talk to me like that. Or what's going on for you here? This is not how you usually act. Or even kind of a you non sequitur, like, where'd you get that shirt? The point is, when you're using a you statement, you're asking the other person to respond to you. You're not taking on this sort of toxic bullying that they're sending your way. Not, it's not always going to make you feel much better, but in my experience, at least starting with the word you and then saying something else helps me retain my sense of agency in the moment.
Thank you for that. I see a question in the chat that kind of connects back to what we were mentioning earlier in terms of some of the feedback that you got with Radical Candor. So the question is, what if no ally is available when you're being biased against? So
Yes.
If there isn't someone else to step into what's happening, whether someone is being biased, prejudiced, or bullying, what advice do you have for people? And also, how do you think about that in terms of someone's identity?
Yes. So I think that very often when this stuff is coming at you, you're not sure whether it's bias, prejudice, and bullying, and that's okay. So you can respond with what you think it is, and then you'll learn something. So if you think it's bias, say the word I, even if you don't know what's going to come out of your mouth next. If it feels like prejudice, say the word it, and then just notice what comes out of your mouth next. If you think it is bullying, say the word you, and then note it. That, for me, that's very helpful, because often I don't know what to say. So that's like an example of what to say when you don't know what to say. What if you don't know what it is? So I'll share a story about a small incident that happened to me, a quote unquote small incident, but it could take us 45 minutes to unpack this. So I was about to go give this another Radical Candor talk. I was about to go on stage and give a Radical Candor talk, and this was at a tech conference. And it was for tech founders, and there were very, very few women at this conference. There were about 150 people and maybe 10 women who were either entrepreneurs or speakers. And so I was about to go on stage and start talking, and this man runs up to me and he says, "Where can I get a safety pin?" And I'm like, what? And I realized that he had popped a button off his shirt, and he assumed that I was one of the people staffing the conference and that it was my job to go fetch him a safety pin. And even though the people staffing the conference were a solid 20 years younger than me and all wearing bright yellow t-shirts, like all he could, they had tried to prevent this kind of thing from happening, the conference organizers, all he could notice was my gender and his need. And so I should have said something. I wish in retrospect that I had said something. And I could have said, I don't work here. It was the classic, I don't know where the safety pins are, if I had assumed it was bias. Or I could have said, that's probably where I would start, actually, with, I don't work here. why didn't, but I said nothing. And I want to kind of, I wish I had said something, but I want to kind of explore why I said nothing. If it were bias, it probably would have been fine. But there's always the possibility that it's prejudice or bullying. So what if I had said, I don't work here? There's some possibility that it was not bias, that he then would have responded and said something like, oh, you're the radical candor lady. I don't believe in that soft, feminine leadership bullshit.
He would have made his position
yeah,
clear.
Yeah. He would have, and he would have stated that he didn't believe I should be up there. And it's unlikely that that would happen, but certainly not impossible. In fact, it has happened to me, as you can imagine, more than once. And in fact, some publishers refused to publish the book for that reason. And
Wow.
so there, that could have happened. And then I would have gone on stage angry, because bias is annoying, but prejudice really can knock me off my game. There's also the possibility that he would have said to me, oh, don't get your panties in a wad. You know, he would have started bullying me. Also, you know, not likely, but has that been said to me before? Yes, it has, more than once. And so I think that when we've experienced a lot of bias, prejudice, and bullying throughout our careers, and I have experienced less. I mean, I have a number of privileges, which means that by and large, I've probably been given credit more than I, deserved. But I think that when you've experienced those things often enough, it can make it harder to respond. It can make it easier and more tempting to default to silence. And somebody's asking a really good question. How much does power have to do with your response? And this is why I so regret not responding, because I was kind of in the role, I thought of myself at the time in the role of the person harmed by this. Yeah. But actually, in that situation, I was a leader. I was one of the speakers at the conference. And so it was actually my job to respond. I didn't have the right, in fact, I would argue, to choose not to respond. If I were only the person harmed, in that case, I would have every right to choose not to respond. But as a leader, I had an obligation to respond so that I could prevent him from saying that kind of thing again. Not to attack him. I mean, if it were bias, he didn't want to be doing that. And if it were prejudice or bullying, it was my job to offer some education.
So you've given us absolutely the responsibility of a leader, but what if someone isn't a leader? They're not a manager. They're not the position in power. What kind of tools do you have for those individuals?
So when you're the person harmed, what I would encourage folks to do is, if it's bias, prejudice, or bullying, to make sure that they're being proactive in choosing their response. And it's perfectly fine to choose silence. Toni Morrison said that the function of racism is distraction. It keeps us from getting our work done. And I think that's true of racism, of sexism, of bias, prejudice, and bullying, in all the different ways they make themselves manifest. And so you get to choose whether or not you're going to take the time. It's not your obligation to educate people. But at the same time, I think there's a risk in defaulting to silence, as I said before, because very often in my career, I told myself I was choosing not to respond, but actually I was defaulting to silence. And over time, that sort of robbed me of a feeling of agency. And especially as I got more senior in my career, I had more of I was more of a leader. I had more of an obligation. It was easier also for me to speak out than it was earlier in my career. But I think that the other thing that I recommend, if you're the person harmed, is to begin to build solidarity with others, because it's so easy to feel gaslit in the heat of the moment. And so talking to other people, there was one person who I talked to who said that they organized a spaghetti dinner once a month with a bunch of underrepresented colleagues, and they would talk about the most ridiculous thing that happened to them at work, and they would practice with each other how to respond when it happens again. And so I think that kind of solidarity is really important to build so that you don't feel so gaslit. I also think it can be really helpful to begin documenting what's happening, even if you have no intention of suing. But that can also help dispel gaslighting, because it's so easy to feel like, is it me? Like, did I do something wrong? And especially in the case of bullying. And so just writing down what happened can help dispel gaslighting. And then the other thing I would encourage people who are harmed by these behaviors to do is to locate the exit nearest you. Early in my career, I had a really pretty terrible experience. And when I finally quit and took a new job, several people came to me and said, "Why didn't you tell me you were looking? I would have hired you." And I had no idea that, I mean, and granted, this is probably speaking from a position of privilege. We often are in a situation where it's not so easy to get another job. But knowing, like, go out there and explore and find out if you can locate the exit nearest you, because then it makes it much easier to respond with, more forcefully than you might otherwise respond.
And to take your agency back. Your
Yes.
story reminds me, when I was more junior in my career, I was working in Europe for an extended period of time, and my
Mhm.
manager was French. I'm American. And I don't know if it was bias, prejudice, or bullying, but she made a point to dismiss almost anything I said with, "She doesn't understand, she's American." It didn't matter what I was saying. And she always said it about me to other people. And it was really deflating. It was definitely gaslighting. It made me question, my confidence, my self-worth. And to that point about, I documented it for a while. I tried to get HR involved, and
Mhm.
that wasn't really successful. And at some point I just took my agency back and decided to leave the organization.
Yeah, I would say that's probably prejudice. I mean, she was justifying it. She was
Yeah.
saying it out loud, but I don't know. I mean, you never really know what's going
Mm-hmm.
on. And often prejudice and bullying go hand in hand.
Yes.
So it's not like these things are mutually exclusive and collectively exhausted. There's overlap between bias, prejudice, and bullying.
Absolutely. The bullying could be based on prejudice.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we have time for questions, and also spend a little time exploring the word upstander, which some folks might refer to as an ally. But if you could talk a little bit more about the role of upstanders and how to be one at work, Kim, that would be super helpful for the audience.
Sure. So the role of upstander is to intervene. That's your responsibility. And the goal is to stand up to the bias or the prejudice or the bullying or whatever, maybe it was discrimination or harassment or a physical violation, but to stand up. You notice something and it didn't seem right and you want to stand up to it. It's not standing up for someone. You don't want to wind up like the knight in shining armor or the white savior or something like
Yes.
that. But you want to make sure that you are acknowledging what happened. And there's an organization called Hollaback that has the 5 Ds, and you can do this directly. Like, maybe you can say something uh, to the person who was causing harm directly, but maybe that doesn't feel safe.
Mm.
Maybe you want to just delay. Maybe you want to pull the person who was harmed by the behavior aside later and talk to them and say, "Are you okay?" And that can be actually really valuable. There was one time when I was working with I love the French, but I'm going to tell a story a story about a Frenchman who I worked with, who he was introducing me and two colleagues who were men to an audience of like 5,000 people. So there are a lot of people in the room.
Mm.
And he introduced the first man and shook his hand, and introduced the second man and shook his hand. And then he introduced me, and I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And he grabbed it and kissed it, like practically licked it. It was a totally cringe moment.
Mm.
And that was gross. Like, that was not ideal. But what was
Mm.
even worse was that nobody came up to me later and said that was weird, or
Yeah.
and then I was like, was I the only person who thought that was weird? So it was, if you don't at the very least check in with the person, then you're sort of contributing to the gaslighting they may be
Hmm.
experiencing. The third thing you can do is you can delegate. You can ask someone else who may be in a better position than you are to intervene. You can document what is happening, or you can just create a distraction. There's an article in the Times about Snack Man, this guy who sort of threw his potato chips in on a subway to distract someone who was who was pursuing someone else. So that to me is very helpful, because one of the reasons why I wrote Just Work is in gratitude for the large number of people in my career who were upstanders. But I don't want to tell upstanders. I don't want to give upstanders advice that's going to cause more harm for them. So there's a lot of different ways to stand up to something wrong when you notice it.
Awesome. Well, we've got a few minutes for questions. And it sounds like most of them are coming from people who probably aren't in positions of leadership and aren't managers. There's a question around, at some point we have to pick our battles. How do you recommend we do that? And also connected, do you ever consider what's the opportunity cost to action versus putting it in a box?
Yes. So I think that this is a very personal choice.
Mhm.
What I would encourage people to do is to sort of try to understand do a cost benefit analysis. What's the cost? What are the risks? And the risks
Mhm.
are real. I don't want to pretend they're not there, of
Yeah.
speaking up, but also make sure you understand the risks of remaining silent.
Mhm.
What is that doing to your self-esteem? What is that doing to your sense of agency? I also want to encourage people. Very often people they experience these things, and rather than admitting to themselves that they're starting to look for a new job and they already have one foot out the door, uh, they pretend like they're ignoring it, you know.
Mhm.
And if they had realized that they could get another job, and that therefore the risks, that mitigates a lot of the risks of talking to the person who said or did the bias, prejudice, or bullying thing, then all of a sudden it becomes safer to have these conversations. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the person will say, "Oh my gosh, I am really sorry," and you won't
Yeah.
have to leave your job. And so I think you want to protect yourself, but creating the conditions and the possibility for the right thing to happen,
Mhm.
it can be helpful. But I don't want to overpromise. Like, very often you'll talk to the person and they'll behave in the worst possible way. But that's
Yeah.
okay if you already know you can get another job somewhere else.
Yes, I like that cost benefit analysis. Another interesting question we have is trying to understand the difference between a toxic colleague and bullying. So, how would you classify and deal with a toxic colleague who indirectly bullies other people?
Uh, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, a toxic colleague is usually a bully,
Mhm.
but sometimes a toxic colleague can be very passive aggressive, not sort of an overt. And sometimes that passive aggressive toxic colleague is harder to deal with than the one who is more of an overt bully. So I think that the thing to do is to to try to avoid labeling people and start to
Mm,
break down actions.
mm,
What is this person doing? What is this person saying that is problematic? And because there are some people who are toxic, who when they become aware that they're saying or doing things that are toxic, will change. They really don't want to be toxic. And
mhm,
even sometimes people who are bullies, in the no asshole rule, Bob Sutton talks about people who are bona fide assholes and people who
mm.
are temporary assholes. And so making sure that you're creating the space for improvement is really important, while again at the same time protecting yourself. I think bullying, the deeper definitions of bullying say that someone is intentionally causing harm and they're doing it repeatedly and they won't stop when you point it out to them.
Mm.
And so I think that is useful to think about. Whereas, like, I tell a bunch of stories in the book about times when I bullied people,
Yeah.
but when they pointed it out to me, I did stop. So I think I was a temporary bully, not a bona fide bully.
Mm. Just for 5 minutes.
Yes.
One last question I'll come back to. We started on this, but just to make sure we get a clear answer for everyone. What if the bully is your manager? What's your advice?
Yeah, when the bully is your manager, you're often moving into either verbal harassment territory or you're moving into physical violation territory. There's when you layer power on top of bullying, you get behavior that gets much worse. So I think that the first thing to do is build solidarity, like talk to other people. I think start to document what is happening and find your exit option. And then you have a choice. You could talk directly to your manager, you could talk to HR, or you could just quit. And there's no one right answer in that situation. But I think that if you feel pretty confident that you do have other options, and if you would prefer to keep that job because you like it, for maybe you like your colleagues, maybe you like the actual content of your work, I think it's worth it to try to have a conversation with your boss. I mean, again, don't go into it in a foolhardy way, which I've done many times in my life. I had had a boss who told me my jeans weren't tight enough, and then he sent someone on the team out to buy me the tightest pair of pants I'd ever owned in my life.
Oh,
I know,
gosh.
gross. And I was so, like, deep in denial. I called a friend and I said, "Oh, isn't this nice? He's trying to help me." And she was like, "Hey, Kim, you've lost your mind here. This is not
Mm.
nice." And so I think that it is important to talk to other people and to make sure that you're neither so deeply gaslit that you're trying to convince yourself that this person is doing you favors when they're absolutely not. And I think it is at the same time important to talk to and I did wind up talking to him. I didn't wind up staying there, but he's never bought anybody tight jeans ever again.
Thank goodness.
Yes, thank
Kim,
goodness.
Kim, I want to make sure actually we get a chance for you to share your purple flag. A lot of the storytelling examples we have been around how individuals can disrupt, a lot of these situations. But what I like about your purple flag is this is something that people could potentially introduce at an organizational level and take that burden off individuals.
Yes.
Do you want to give us like a very short description of what it is and how you use it?
Yes, absolutely. So, what can leaders do to make it more likely that upstanders will stand up to bias when they notice it, and that people who are harmed by bias know what to say when they don't know what to say? So, there's three steps that leaders can take. The first is to come up with a shared vocabulary. What's the word or phrase that you and your team will use to disrupt bias when they notice it? So, I like purple flag. I was working with the IDEO team, and we agree that there is something that's more beautiful that this could use some designing. So we're going to come up with something better than the purple flag. But that's what I like. Other teams, though, throw up a peace sign. Another team will say, "I don't think you meant that the way it sounded." Another team will say, "Ouch." The key thing is to sit down with your team and agree on a shared vocabulary. So that's step number one. Step number two is to agree on a norm for how to respond when you're the person who caused harm, when it's you who's biased, who's being pointed out. Because I don't know about you all, but when someone points out to me that I've said or done something biased, I feel deeply ashamed. And when I'm in shame brain, I am never at my best. And so it's useful to be able to fall back on kind of a script almost. So thank you for pointing it out. And either I get it and I'm working on not doing it again, or I don't get it. And that second thing is really hard to say because now I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've harmed someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't even know what I did wrong. But we are all bound to be in that situation some of the time. In this, we are living in a world of bias. We're pattern makers. Some of the patterns are bad. And only if we can disrupt that bias publicly can we not reinforce it. Can we begin to develop a better pattern? Which brings me to the third step. If you get to the end of a meeting and nobody has waved the purple flag or whatever word or phrase you're using, then take a beat. 30 seconds. I'm not talking about a long time. We're talking about disrupting bias, not disrupting every meeting you're ever in. But take a beat to say, what did we miss? What did someone say or do something that was biased in this meeting? And in fact, I invite all of you. I bet I said or did some biased things in the course of this. Please tell me what they are. Drop it into the chat because I want to know. I want to get better.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kim. Thank you for taking a moment to explain that and inviting others to design something or share something in their own organizations. And yes, once Kim and IDEO have worked on the evolution of the purple flag, we will share that out as well. So thank you all for joining us today on the Creative Confidence Podcast. Today, we've been hearing from Kim Scott, author of Just Work, about how to confront bias, prejudice, and bullying at work. I encourage you to grab a copy of her book. Also start using the I, it, you, Just Work framework yourselves. Kim has lots of specific tools that you can apply to your work immediately. IDEO offers online courses on design thinking, innovation, leadership, collaboration, and more. If you're looking for more resources to help foster collaboration and tap into diverse perspectives in your team, I invite you to check out our course on cultivating creative collaboration, which starts just in a few weeks on May 25th. You can find out more information about that course at ideou.com/collaboration. Our course enrollment closes tonight, actually. So please check it out. And just go to ideou.com. Once again, thank you so much, Kim. We really appreciate you joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Loved being here.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for calling in.